Well, hello, free people of the Rocky Mountain region. Today, I'm joined by Natalie Menten to provide an update on the 2023 housing bills. Natalie, I hope you are well, and thank you for joining me again.
I am well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, last week, we had an in-depth conversation on House Bill 23, 1190, and there have been changes to this bill in committee. Natalie, can you please give us an update on House Bill 1190 and the changes made through amendments?
Sure. So real quick, House Bill 23-1190 is a Colorado bill, and it is nicknamed the Affordable Housing Right of First Refusal. And what it is basically doing is allowing government the right of first refusal when it comes to purchase of certain types of qualifying properties. And that's multi-unit, residential, and mixed use. And so it's just a refresher. That's what the bill was doing. And basically, what it was started out with was a bill that would have tied up property sales for months. And on top of that, there were certain restrictions which would have given, again, the government first right of refusal, but put price caps on those sales under penalty if you did not comply. And the penalty being $50,000 or 30% of the value or the sale, depending on whichever one is greater. So there was testimony this last week. They did make some amendments to this bill. So one thing to start with, first of all, so what 1190 was doing, again, one of these changes that came from the hearing last week is a change in the amount of units a property needed to have to make it a qualifying property where the government got that first right of refusal. So whereas it was 3 units in the urban areas and 5 units in rural areas, that's now changed to where it's 5 units in the urban and 15 units in the rural areas. And it's important. I want you to remember the 5 units because we'll discuss this a little bit later. But there is that increase so that it will, in theory, affect less properties. The government again has the right, first right, to purchase this property. And when it started out, the timeline from when you had a triggering event to when you gave notice to the government, they had a timeline to respond, to make an offer, and then to close was over 200 days, meaning over 6 months of delay while a property owner could be held up while the government decided what they were going to do, got financing, etc. That timeline has been, in theory, shrunk, where now it states 90 days, which is quite a considerable change. The problem is, as I talked about in the last podcast video we did, there's a clause in there for that calls for tolling period. And what a tolling period basically means, if there's an event outside the government's control, it can extend that timeline that's presented in the law. And there is really no hard cap. There is a suggested 90 days now. But at the end of the day, if there are events that are outside of the government's control, it could easy to see where it could be months beyond what is stated of that 90 days. One of the bigger changes that came along was in the first versions, this applied to all multi-unit properties, residential and mixed use. What they did make is one change where that is now going to only affect this first right of refusal is available on properties that are 30 years of age or older. So that's a pretty notable change. It really has to do with the financing. Some of the other issues, there were different investment firms that spoke to the problems where included all properties of all types. So those are really some of the major changes that came out. At the end of the day, the same concerns are still present. It's giving the government the right to buy a property before the private market. And the guidelines and the actual rules, the regulations that are imposed on a property owner amount to being used as a property taking, certainly potential in some cases. So those problems are still there. The bill is going to be heard this Monday. by the Senate for second reading. And that means Tuesday should be the first day that they would be taking a vote. So there's still time to speak out about this. And while some people may think that it affecting only now properties that are 30 years or older, it's only properties that are 5 units in the urban area or 15 units in the rural, does not affect them. Well, there's a reason they should still be concerned. One of the other clauses in here is, let's say you're a tenant and you live at one of these properties and the government takes ownership of it. The law is written that if you make too much income for the affordable housing program, you are not going to probably get your lease renewed if you make too much money. So while it only seems to affect this group over here, this special group, and this one over here, I would certainly hope it would drive it home when tenants are realizing, just because they are able to make the income and happen to be in that certain building, the fact that the government's coming in to take ownership and it might affect the tenant's life should be a cause enough for concern that people don't like something like this pass without speaking up.
Wow. Yeah, it's one of those issues that affects more people than they're seen on the surface. It's something that could affect the whole community in terms of shifting away from privately owned property to government controlled property and all the problems that come along with that. No, I think you're 100% right in terms of residential property owners needing to stand up and speak out against this attempt to reshape their community. Nobody wants more density, nobody wants more crowded neighborhoods. And actually, there was a poll conducted by Rasmussen in August of last year that showed that 63% of Colorado voters want state and local governments to restrict development to make it more difficult for people to move to Colorado from other states. So 63% of Colorado voters oppose this type of legislation that's being pushed, 1190 and the other housing bills that we're seeing this year. Now, people got to remember, Jared Polis only won his reelection last year with 59% of the vote. So there's more voters who oppose these types of housing schemes to increase the density, to increase the amount of people moving here, than there are people who actually voted for the governor last year. So I mean, it's obvious that Polis and his legislative lackeys are just completely out of touch with Colorado voters. They're pushing an agenda that is not supported by the majority of the people or the local governments they're pushing this on. This same poll found that only 7% of Colorado likely voters want the state's populations to continue growing rapidly. 62% of voters believe the state is a worse place to live because of urban development. So this type of housing schemes that we're seeing this legislative session are completely contrary to the wishes of the voters and are reshaping our community. I mean, it really is an attack on our way of life.
Well, and what they're trying to state in these different bills that are coming along is that somehow this is going to make things more affordable. Well, between the fact that the government's now entered the market, affordable housing typically costs like 25-30% more for development, refurbishing, all the different things. As soon as you got government's hand in it, you've got that price increase. How does this make any of this more affordable? There's enough people in Colorado that have lived here long enough to recognize we've got water issues in Colorado. We are not like some other states where the water is flowing in. So this push for density, when 80%, I mean, there's a gentleman, Randal O'Toole's done a lot of different studies, years worth of this stuff. And where do people prefer to live? If you talk to the average person, you ask them, do you want a place where you can grow your own vegetables and your dog has a backyard, or do you want to go live in a stacked building? Majority of the people want to have that first option. There are some that do want to be downtown, granted, but I live in the area I live. I don't want to live downtown. No way. It's already creeping out here way too much.
Oh, definitely. And especially with 1192, by turning the housing market over to government hands, to bureaucrats and political hands, as opposed to private entrepreneurs, it totally shifts the system. Like you said, it can create a system in which, people have to stay poor in order to stay housed. I mean, what kind of incentive is that for people in the community? I mean, what does that do to the social fabric that we have? I mean, it's the complete opposite of the American dream. The American dream is to own a house, to raise your family in a house, to be part of a community. Like you said, grow your own vegetables, have a garage, have that freedom that comes with home ownership. And these housing bills are a direct attack on single family home ownership.
Looking back to the 1190 with the comment I made about the tenants, if you make too much money, I mean, what kind of motivation is that? If you're going to be ousted, you don't get your lease renewed. What is the motivation to go out and get a higher paying job, perhaps, when you have the counteract of you're going to be evicted from that living situation because the government's taken over and saying, nope, you make too much, whether it's $5,000 or 1,000 or 50 or you know that's government manipulating a social behavior. And um, so going forward, when we look at this density, these other bills really kind of tie together, and I'm trying to grasp it as well as possible. But I got to say, it is definitely a challenge when that legislature is driven to drive this density into areas that don't necessarily want it. Some places clearly don't want it. And it is all in the name of affordable housing, which it is not proven that what they're doing is going to result in that.
Right. It benefits people at the very bottom of the economic, system in terms of the people who can't afford anything else. But these programs totally erode the middle class by preventing people from being able to move up and actually find a place that they can afford to live. Of course, the wealthy or the ultra wealthy are going to be fine through all of this. But this zoning problem, as you talked about, is really exemplified in Senate Bill 213. So, what information can you share with us, Natalie, on Senate Bill 213?
Sure. I think we covered that a little bit last time, but go into that a little bit more. This is in the big picture. Most people are somewhat familiar that if they have a zoning type of an issue, they're really dealing with the city government, a local government, county maybe. So that when we talk about local government, it's cities, towns, counties. They control the zoning. What Senate Bill 213 does proposes to eliminate local control to instead turn it over to the state government. So your zoning becomes even farther and farther away from the community you actually live in. And it seems to be, well, it's not even seems to be. The governor and the legislature that are behind this bill have clearly said what they want to do is drive more density into Colorado. So it's very interesting that you brought up the Rasmussen article earlier or poll before, when we've got the state legislature in the majority and the governor pushing this density in, and over 60% of the population, I believe is what you said. That's not what they're envisioning for the future of Colorado. So Senate Bill 213 has met extreme outrage from there was hours and hours of testimony from local governments that are very upset, have issued resolutions condemning this piece of legislation. And at this moment, there are some changes to what, proposed changes, because they haven't voted on it yet. So just the other day, I believe it was Thursday, they had, I think it was several hours of testimony. And it was known actually prior to that they were going to take just testimony and come back to vote at a later date, along with more debate, because it's just started to move forward. This bill's fairly new. So they've proposed a change. So one of the things in the original language was that it would basically say any neighborhood that was single family only residential would no longer be allowed. And those single family only residential areas would then have to allow multi-unit. That could mean anything from townhomes to apartments to, one thing especially of note is accessory dwelling units. And it would take away minimum lot sizes. Now, if I go back to the ADUs for a moment, the accessory dwelling units, what it was proposing is on a residential property, single family residential, or even further than that, I would say, up to 6 accessory dwelling units. So if you picture in your a regular neighborhood with single family homes, what this would be saying is that in the backyards of these homes, they could build up to 6 accessory dwelling units. So that's 6 separate living units. That got notched down after what's being proposed with one of the amendments is to take that down to 4 units. Now, if you remember earlier in the conversation, I mentioned to keep the number 5 in mind when we were talking about the first right of refusal bill. So let's say you have this proposed Senate Bill 213, and you have the ADUs. So you've got the main home, the main structure, and you've got 4 potential ADUs in the back or the side yard, wherever they may be. You are now going to have 5 total units. It's important to note, wrapping that in, when I talked about the right of first refusal, that qualifying property in the urban area was stating a qualifying property was 5 units or more. And most people don't really envision that occurring in their neighborhood. But when you couple that with Senate Bill 213, which is going to now have state zoning overriding the local zoning and saying you can have 4 ADUs on a single family property, which therefore creates 5 units. To me, in my mind, that says you have now added in anybody who does the ADUs, you're open to all the rules, regulations associated with government having the first right to buy that property based upon all those rules that are in that first bill I spoke about. So again, it's trying to get all these puzzle pieces together, because I'm just talking about a few of the bills. There's more beyond these ones. And I'm not going to claim to be an expert on those, but that's one of the concerns that's still present with 213. And I would say it's actually, my concerns have actually grown now more that I've pieced these parts together more and more so they fit right. It's almost like a puzzle where, yeah, it fits exactly right until you look at the little notch. Then you have to find one that's similar and then it fits. Well, that's how these pieces are starting to fit together. And how are they going to get this density into the neighborhoods that are resistant to it? And these are the mechanisms to do it. What government likes to call them tools in the toolbox. So these are the tools to put in their toolbox to bring the density into the neighborhoods. There were some other changes with 213. One, there is a sunset, August 2028. I don't have a lot of confidence. I mean, it's better than forever, but still 2028 is pretty far out in the future. And I'm especially concerned with a piece I'll talk about in just a moment. That's with Prop 123. With 213, we haven't seen anything firmly passed as an amendment. So for the moment, we really have to deal with what is in that original text and hope for the best. But they're fairly driven to get this bill through. I mean, after the amount of hours of testimony they've got, and their hometowns are screaming at them, are you kidding? You're going to take away our local zoning and replace it with state? It is, I mean, it's been a while since I've seen local governments this upset about something, a mandate handed down. And so I'm going to jump next to what are the next steps for 213. After these multiple hours of testimony, they have not yet set a date for this bill to be heard. Actually, all that will occur in this next committee meeting would be that they would vote on it. Then from there, it would go to the Senate floor and then move through the House. So the point being, there's time to still fight this. Plenty of time, really. I mean, if it was 1st of May, I'd be a little more concerned. But this is going to drag its heels because the amount of pressure on the legislature is pretty tremendous. But on the other hand, they are very driven to get this density into our community. They feel the housing is needed. I started to question more and more the number of housing units they say that we need. And if it comes down to the old saying, if you build it, they will come. We are not just talking about a current population here. If we continue to have government handout programs, it does not do anything but encourage more population growth within Colorado. And where do we ever stop that subsidy cycle? How do you stop it when the government continues to feed it, promote it, and actually create rules and regulations that sometimes push people awkwardly to stay in a position as you described? So that's where 213 is moving forward. And if you have any questions or comments about it, I'll let you go with that before I jump into Prop 123 and how this really ties all the pieces together.
Well, it is interesting to see the outcry, the anger in these local communities. For example, we have a great libertarian mayor in Keensburg, Colorado, Aaron Lamb, and his town board put out a very strongly worded condemnation of this bill. And they're not alone. I mean, it's communities all across Colorado who are opposing the state government coming in and rewriting their zoning laws. So one of the questions is, with so much opposition, isn't this bill destined to fail at that point, or are we going to just see it amended to try and pacify some of the more vocal critics?
And it will be interesting to see. And there's so many pieces that are in movement with this thing. I spoke about just residential, single family residential areas, but what's in this proposal, and I need to confirm if this number is going to change in the proposed amendments or not. But in transit mixed use areas, which we used to call when I was on RTD and with RTD fast tracks, TMU. So transit mixed use. Now they're calling it TMO, and I got to look up what their newest acronym for this is. But the density minimums that the state zoning, these proposed zoning laws would create is like 40 minimum units if in 1 acre, so 40 units within 1 acre, if you're in a transit mixed use area. But also what's tied into this bill is actually transportation centers. So you would have intersections. So if it's I-25 and 6th Avenue, as an example, or somewhere where that transit hub is. So not only public transit, but traditional, faster transportation, which would be what I typically use. Any of the developments around those areas are also affected by this density in much greater level, because what the government is trying to say is the more we pack people in, they'll jump on RTD. Now, having served on the RTD board for 8 years, and that was during the good years where there wasn't quite as much fentanyl use, there wasn't quite as many safety concerns. I don't mean to laugh because it's terrible. Getting ridership back on RTD is going to be a challenge. To drive people, to pack them in around these transit hubs, and for them not to own a car does not work out the way the government wishes it would. That's not the way it works. One of the other big things they had in 213 also, where they did reverse, is with all this additional density, they also were reducing the parking requirements that you would normally have with that kind of a load. And they've backed off on that, where there would be at some levels. Again, none of these have been formally voted on. So who knows what's in the works right now? And I hate to quote off of a proposed amendment until it's actually a done deal. So there's so many more other little things with this bill. So back to, even if you don't think you are directly affected by these, your neighborhoods certainly can be affected by these things. I think of the RTD Fast Tracks area, there's a lot of bigger lots up there with a lot of potential to pack stuff in. So when you think your neighbor who has goats all of a sudden says they're moving, you don't know that you're getting somebody moving back in who's going to have a little cottage operation and goats. There might be mandates there where you can expect quite a few more neighbors to replace the one that's moving out.
Well, Coloradans do not want more traffic. We do not want development of our open space. We don't want more crime. We don't want the cost of living to keep increasing. But that's what these policies are going to do. It's going to totally destroy some of the communities that people have saved so hard. I think about these first-time homeowners or people who've lived here their whole lives, like myself, who maybe, are on the verge of homeownership or save so much, work so hard to buy a nice residential home in a quiet neighborhood. And here we go, everything they've saved for, everything they've worked for, the vision they have for their family is now being destroyed by the governor and his policies to try and push this high density housing into their neighborhood. Where now all of a sudden kids can't play in the street because traffic's out of control and there's so many people crammed into these small areas that it's just an uncomfortable place to live. So homeowners across Colorado need to be outraged, need to stand up and speak out against Senate Bill 213 and these other housing schemes we're seeing.
Yeah, and I got to double check where the emergency clause is still on this. I believe it. I don't know that I saw an amendment to drop the emergency clause. So as an example with the land use, this is about the land use one, that the emergency clause is at the end of a bill and states whether citizens have the right it says whether citizens would not have the right to do a petition and call for a referendum, basically putting a halt on what the government had passed to law. So halt that, let the voters weigh in. So when the safety clause is on a bill, we don't have the right to go out within 90 days, which is really hard, get the signatures put on the ballot. But at least if you don't have the safety clause, at least you could try, right? It's really hard to get signatures the amount you need for a referendum statewide in 90 days. Last time we did it was with national popular vote. Besides that, it's pretty rare. But this bill is saying you can't even go do that. We, the state government, say this is such a matter of emergency that you don't have the right to call us out on it and get a check on our power. And that's a pretty sad state of affairs. It doesn't speak well for all of the bureaucracy and regulation tied into these bills, because if you don't even care what we're saying to start with, what are you going to do when the law is in place?
Wow. Yeah, and a total affront to this idea of representative government or democracy when it's so crystal clear that these local communities and the voters do not want these policies, but these lawmakers, legislators are pushing them forward anyway. So, Natalie,
Um, I,
yeah, go ahead.
but I just wanted to speak to, I've for many years struggled with the land use issue. And as somebody who believes in the liberty and the right for your property is your property, but there's just so much impact. And then ultimately, the water issue here in Colorado just cannot be ignored. And again, if we build it, they will come. So whatever problems is anticipated and is legit will just increase further on if we continue with badly written legislation like this. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, definitely not a problem at all. But I was just going to say, no, I mean, just to go off that point, I suppose I would say, I believe in local self-governance. I'm a libertarian. I believe in a philosophy of liberty and freedom and personal ownership and private property. But people move to a community for a reason. People are not alone in the world, and people want to be part of a community. They want to live in a community where they feel safe. At least I do. A community of high trust and values that I share. And ultimately, that's the idea that this bill is opposed to, that Senate Bill 213 is opposed to this idea of community, of people coming together and deciding how their community is going to be governed at the most local level possible in a small municipality or a small town. This totally overrides that and forces a one size fits all solution from a central authority onto these local communities. And that's why I believe libertarians, liberty minded individuals should oppose 213 and these other housing bills.
Yeah, and another point, but I don't know if you brought it I think I brought it up a little bit before, is the property tax issues. We've got some skyrocketing property tax bills coming up here because of this increase in values. It's a kind of circular problem, but um, the more properties the government owns, because 213 and 1190 are about government getting more of these properties, well, especially the first right of first refusal. The more properties that come off the tax rolls, the more I, as a property owner or as a consumer, when I go to a buy from a business who's paying property taxes, the more I'm paying to cover the property that got taken off the rolls that's down the street. So it's also financial. At what point do we have to at what point do we stop taking from same people's pockets to build programs that we don't necessarily know or even be working to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, Natalie, how does this all tie into Proposition 123 that was passed last year in the November 2022 election?
Yeah, so Prop 123, simply put, takes part of our upcoming Tabor refunds and puts it into affordable housing and specifically high density subsidized housing. Within the bill, it says that the administrator, who's the one who hands out the bucks for the program, is to give preference to high density. And there's certain criteria that are involved with the handing, how those funds are handed out. Specifically, it's a split of um, the revenue. Let me go back to that for a moment. Comes from state income tax. And because we've got such an excess coming into this, going to state coffers, we're getting Tabor refunds. Well, this takes $300 million a year. Prop 123 takes $300 million a year, puts it into subsidized high density housing. Local governments, to get part of that funding, have to increase density for these subsidized units by 3% per year each year. So if you factor in that growth coupled with the bills I talked about previously tonight, you start to see how this kind of all fits together. When we were arguing over Prop 123 last year, and I participated in debates, I remember posing the question that, especially looking at like landlocked cities, where are you going to pack in this additional 3%? You've got choices. One, you're going to either replace non-subsidized housing with subsidized housing. You're going to have to increase the density. You're going to either build higher. So instead of areas that are single family, you're looking at multi-unit, 2, 3, 4, however many stories might be. And the government doesn't have to do these things, but they won't get any of the Prop 123 money unless they do it. And there's a lot of rules, restrictions. The administrator oversees this program. So again, to get the money, where are you going to put it in? Well, you start to see where this all pieces together now with increasing the density in single family residential areas, basically state proposing to ban single family only zoning, adding ADU units in, having the ability for government to have right of first refusal on what's now appears to be, again, anything urban area, 5 residential units or mixed use, 5 or more. You start to see how government is figuring out the ways to add to the density to do it and add to their inventory to make the numbers match to be able to get that funding. So ultimately, this is an unknown amount of government, additional government housing, because Prop 123 said it could not replace any existing funds going into these programs. It had to be new. So when Prop 123 was going through, housing experts were estimating we're basically turning over 25% of the housing market to the government. So when you add in, again, 1190, 213, where do we end up in that figure? So that's what basically is tying these pieces together. The tons of millions of dollars went into getting Prop 123 passed by certain special interest groups. The mechanics of how that was going to work were not quite clear. But now the Colorado Department of Local Affairs is running workshops on how many additional units the local governments will have to add on. And it's to the tune of, within communities, maybe a few hundred up to several hundred, even potentially into thousands, depending on how they calculate that formula. So this is now how all these pieces seem to be fitting together. And sadly, I feel like I'm still missing multiple pieces of this jigsaw. And it's almost like 3D chess, keeping track of between local governments, the state government, and how does it all interplay.
Wow. Yeah. So between Proposition 123, Senate Bill 213, House Bill 1190, it's definitely government program piling on government program to just keep restricting our property rights, to take more for the government, take more out of the private sector. And it's a perfect example of how, the one government program targets a small part of the community. They can win over voters or win support because it's not affecting me as a residential homeowner in Arvada necessarily, because these bills don't. But then this other bill attacks another segment of society, and you think, hey, it's not going to affect me necessarily. Well, by the time they all pile together and it all adds up, it definitely does affect me. It does affect people in the community, and it totally rewrites the whole plan or the whole idea of what our town or what our community is supposed to be.
Yeah, the city of Lakewood, the voters, although I was opposed to it, passed a growth limit here. And there's another bill in the works, I believe it's 1155 or 1255, which would wipe out any growth limits any municipality had put in place. So that includes Lakewood, includes Golden. I believe there's one or two others. Um, uh, Respecting that local choice is important, and for the government stepping in to do what they're doing, we've still got time to fight these things. And I appreciate you saying very much that just because it doesn't affect you directly, um, is not a good reason to be sitting back. There was a bill last year, and it kind of flew by me, and I mean I remember reading about it, but I didn't take the time to fight it. So I'm guilty of this myself. And last year it was with mobile home properties. So they've gotten in the door with one bill last year. We've got an expansion of that this year, and we don't even know what's these missing pieces that haven't even come up yet. I've talked about Initiative 3 a little bit during that last video we did, going through the title board, which is more money out of our pockets proposed to fund these programs. So we're just being hit in all these directions. And with so many days left of the state legislature, it's a little bit frightening to think what might be sliding through, especially in the last like 2 weeks of the legislature. It's hard to have enough citizens. We don't have enough citizens down there keep an eye on this stuff. People are worried about paying their bills, doing their 8 to 5 job. They don't have time to go sit down at the Capitol and compete with government lobbyists. We just don't. But there is
Yeah.
still time to speak up, even if you're not directly affected, even if you're not a renter who might not get renewed on your lease because the government's taken over the building. There's just so many ways this can affect us, and we need to stand together.
Definitely. People need to be mobilized. And going back to that poll from last year where 63% of voters want to restrict development in Colorado. People see this as a negative on our way of life or our quality of life here in society, with more traffic, more crime, more people. People don't want it. So speak up, stand up, contact your legislator, show up at any town halls or meetings that you can go to, and testify, if at all possible, down at the state legislature in these committee hearings. Make your voice heard and stand up for your community and stand against this government dictated high density housing.
Agree. Agree. This is not a good plan here for Colorado. I really appreciate being able to talk about these different things with you and give the update. People can keep it. One thing to keep in mind as these bills do move forward, a lot of people are like, I can't take off time from work. I work from home. I just can't run down the Capitol and waste time parking. Remote testimony is available and it's really quite easy. I believe it's um, go to the state government legislative website, it's leg.colorado.gov, and then /testimony, I think. And it'll allow you to choose the bill, how you want to sign up. It makes it quite easy. And it's by Zoom. So it's they're able to see you if need be, and it does make an impression. And it's very convenient.
Mm, good. And voters need to remember the names of these politicians for 2024 election, these politicians that are totally opposed to the voters' wishes.
Yes, yes. And it's apparently in favor of property takings.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, is that anything else you'd like to leave us with?
There is one other thing. We are having a public meeting. Excuse me, I'm a little bit congested. Um, this next Tuesday in Lakewood, where we're going to be addressing, there's a community meeting this April 11th, 6:30 to 9 p.m. at Rockley's Event Center, West Colfax, and I think it's like 8555 West Colfax. Rockley's Event Center. And it used to be old Rockley's Music Center, where they sold musical instruments. But I've turned it into a venue, and we have a public meeting hosted by Ramey Johnson, former Lakewood City Councilor, and I'll be one of the panelists along with Randal O'Toole. And Randal has been studying the issues of urban growth and especially government planning and transportation for many, many, many years. He has a wealth of information. So he'll be joining in by Zoom, where we update the community, especially that area because they're by transit mixed use, so their density is way greater than what I described for the average place. But it's excuse me, 6:30 to 9 p.m. And we would love to have anybody join us who would like to get a little more information. And we'll have more updates at that time because House Bill 1190 will have gone through on second reading. We'll know maybe a little more on Senate Bill 213. And we'll be talking about probably a couple other housing bills that I just don't want to go into depth on right now because I actually have to check on updates on them first before I feel good about going and talking about the current circumstance.
Well, Natalie, thank you so much for all your hard work. Thank you for standing up for Colorado and keep us updated. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Brandon.